The Austrian GP may have been a lot of things, but uneventful is certainly not one of them. Naturally, there are loads to unpack, so let's just jump right in. Heading into the weekend, we had plenty of news in terms of the driver market, Gasly's extension, and a true shocker, Stroll's multi-year deal with Aston Martin. Just look at the pictures Formula 1 and Sky Sports chose to announce Stroll. I found that really funny that this is the best picture Sky Sports could find. Aside from that, the Red Bull political game never ceased to exist. Apparently there is beef now between Horner and Jos Verstappen, and so this Helmut Marko, Jos Verstappen versus Horner thing just seems to continue endlessly, and to be frank, I'm a bit over it by this point, so let's go ahead and talk about the track itself. The Austrian track is located about 700 meters above sea level, and so the circuit has some low air density characteristics. Although the track layout would require medium to low downforce setups, because of the higher altitude, more downforce is required, and so teams are using similar rear wings to what they were using in Spain. The lower air density translates to less oxygen, which oftentimes causes engine issues. This weekend we did not have a lot of those. There was Verstappen during free practice, but that was just a brief moment. And of course the Leclerc anti-stall issue is a bit of a question mark still. Big updates for the track this year were the gravel traps in turn 9 and 10. This is to avoid those 1200 potential track limit violations that the FIA had to work through last year. And I will be honest, I think these worked pretty well. Those who went too wide in those turns, like Leclerc and Tsunoda did, they were punished pretty heavily. The other thing is that there is now AI tech implemented in other corners, where there is a camera next to that blue strip you may have seen during the race, and that camera records whether the driver left the track with all 4 of their wheels. And if they did, there is a almost real-time reaction to it using the AI technology, so the FIA, they don't need to take so much time to determine whether track limits were violated or not. This is again good because we do not have retrospective changes after sessions, which can be really disappointing to fans and to drivers alike. We only had one free practice session, and most teams opted to either test their mediums or the hards, and then at the end they had a short stint on the softs to check their one-lap pace. One relevant information from the free practice would be that Hamilton did not test his softs at all. However, he did have a pretty long stint on the hard compounds, and his tire degradation seemed good. So I guess that's the major takeaway. Norris could not set a time on the soft, so his time is not really comparable to his teammate. And right away, Perez and Verstappen seemed to be pretty far apart. In a blink of an eye, shootout came, and I feel like we entered a parallel universe where Sargeant out-qualified Albon and Magnussen out-qualified Hulkenberg. I feel like because there was only one free practice, this is where we see that the difference between teammate number 1 and teammate number 2 usually comes from the experience that they have throughout 3 free practices. This is not something that was available this case, and so those differences between the number 1 and number 2 drivers, they were tiny, and in this case, rather reversed. In SQ2, Magnussen continued to be very impressive. He almost got into Q3. He was off by less than half a tenth, I think. The Astons had a devastatingly slow pace, so I wouldn't even comment on that any further. Tsunoda's car, and therefore his lap, was compromised in SQ2, as in SQ1 he went too wide in turn 9, and that caused a major issue in his package. By the way, he out-qualified Ricciardo even with that mistake in the previous session, so I'd imagine that the gap would have been much bigger between the teammates. In the last segment of the sprint quali session, there were 3 notable things happening. One, Verstappen and Norris were very close again. I think the majority of Verstappen's advantage came from sector 1 and sector 3, but other than that, the gap between them was under a tenth. The second thing was Leclerc's anti-stall issue, which prevented him from setting a time. And then the third notable thing is that huge gap between Verstappen and Perez, which was mostly there because Ocon was really slow, and therefore Perez couldn't take the most out of that lap. And then I think Gasly's lap was compromised as a result too, because those 3 were running in just one package at the end. Therefore, we can see that huge gap between Perez and Verstappen, and a pretty significant one between Ocon and Gasly as well. Hamilton and Piastri were both about 2/10 off of their teammates. Hamilton lost that time mostly in sector 2, which is a returning pattern this weekend. The other major gap to address is between Bottas and Joe. Joe was apparently in traffic. mistake. Not that his quality performance has been very impressive so far, but that's for his defense. So during the sprint, everybody started on mediums. Leclerc had a pretty good start overtaking Perez, and the McLarens were much faster than Verstappen in the first few laps. That is what led to lap 5 when Norris overtook Verstappen, but then Verstappen took his position back because Norris left a pretty big door open, which also meant that Piastri overtook Norris as well. And from that point on, once Verstappen was out of the DRS range, the McLarens couldn't do anything. Piastri was slower than Norris, and Norris couldn't even overtake his teammate at that point. Some say that McLaren should have switched their drivers and let Norris to go after Max, and while I think that he would have been able to catch up, overtaking him is a completely different topic. I don't think that his pace was warranting that possibility. The Saubers had a terrible race pace during the session, especially Joe. Both of the Alpines lost out in this race, and Stroll had a pretty big margin ahead of Alonso. So did Verstappen, I think around 13 seconds ahead of Perez. That was pretty massive too. But other than that, there were not a lot of things happening during the session. The few hours between sprint and quali created massive changes for the Red Bull family as a whole, not just for the senior team, but for RB as well. Verstappen somehow found 4/10 during those hours, which again is a testament to Red Bull as an organization, because remember that although we don't have 3 free practices, the shootout and the sprint itself, those sessions are used to collect data because Parc Fermé rules are out during those few hours between sprint and quali, so teams have the chance to utilize all the data that they collected and take advantage of that, and Red Bull, they were the best in that, no questions. Q1 turned out the way we expected it to. This time, Albon out qualified Sargeant, but both of the Williams drivers were out, Saubers too, and then Stroll was behind Alonso, so I think everything was back to its normal ways. During Q2, the RBs looked promising, especially Ricciardo, who qualified 11th. Alonso was miles off of everybody, and Verstappen was miles ahead of everyone, which continued into Q3 as well. A few things to note for Q3, that Leclerc mistake. This time he was not unfortunate with the anti-stall / other engine issues, but he went way too wide and that compromised his lap. Now I looked into Leclerc's sectors leading into that mistake in turn 9, and I have to say it would have taken a miracle for Leclerc to finish ahead of Hamilton, not to mention Sainz. So I understand that he was doing everything to gain the most positions possible during the session, but I don't think it was worth it. Another important thing during the session was Piastri's mistake in turn 6. He went a bit too wide. He didn't gain an advantage, of course, because he touched the gravel, but rules are rules, and this is the same corner that Sargeant went too wide in SQ2, so you could argue that if we don't delete Piastri's time, we don't delete Sargeant's time either. Now, of course, the extent of the track limit violation wasn't the same in those two cases, but I'm just saying that the FIA needs to be consistent in this case. And the best thing that they can do is that they widen that gravel trap in turn 6, and this will not happen probably again. Or if it does, then the driver loses out massively. Now let's look at the head-to-head table beside me. Unfortunately, that gap column, which should have a beautiful gradual color palette going from red to green, is not really behaving the way it's supposed to, and that is because of Mr. Sergio Perez, who had a major gap behind his teammate, and therefore compared to him, everybody did well in comparison to their teammates. Where did that massive gap come from? Unfortunately, Perez did not have a fresh set of soft tires at the end, while the others did, and so he could not have the best and cleanest lap at the end. But then one could argue the reason why he didn't have a set of fresh softs at the end was because he lacked the pace all throughout the different sessions, and that's why he needed to use them to begin with. Russell's advantage ahead of Hamilton was again mainly attributed to Sector 2, and Piastri's and Norris lap times cannot really be compared. Their difference would have been, I think, under a 10th, which is pretty good for Piastri overall, but because Piastri's lap time was deleted, his previous lap was much farther away from Norris's. And now on to the race itself. Right away in lap 1 we had some action. Leclerc was sandwiched, he suffered wing damage, and a similar thing happened to Sargeant. They had to pit, and it was wild to me that around lap 30 Ferrari told Leclerc that he was going to get into the points even without a safety car, and he ended up 11th, and that is with Norris DNFing. So I don't know what Ferrari were thinking, but I digress. There was a bit of pushing between Piastri and Perez as well. For Perez forced Piastri a little bit too wide, and he also suffered a side pod damage that was pretty significant, which explains some of his disadvantage during the race. But on to my favorite part, which was strategies. The forecasted strategy was medium, hards, and then back to mediums, but not everybody opted for that. We have seen several drivers going from mediums to hards and then hards again, and there were a few who benefited from it a lot. So let's look at the difference in strategies between Tsunoda and Ricciardo. Both of them had a similar strategy in terms of using the same compounds. However, Ricciardo had a pit stop after 10 laps on his medium stint, while Tsunoda had that after 21 laps, and that made a huge difference because during those 10 laps, Ricciardo was gaining about a tenth per lap on average, which is wild, and that obviously provided him with a strategical advantage at the end. Don't get me wrong, Ricciardo qualified ahead of Tsunoda, so he deserved that position at the end. I'm just saying that Tsunoda could have been handed a better strategy as well. So talking about the early medium pit stop and then going for 2 sets of hard subject, Hulkenberg and Magnussen were following the same strategy essentially as Ricciardo, and this is why I'm saying that this strategy was superior, I think, to all the other ones during this race weekend. Looking at the Hulkenberg versus Perez pace a little bit deeper, what was important for Hulkenberg is to go for the second hard stint as quickly as possible. During the time he was on the hards and Perez was still doing his middle stint, he was about a tenth faster on average than Perez, which obviously gave him a huge advantage. And at the end, surprisingly, his used hard tires were not a whole lot off of Perez's new medium tires. I think he was about 3/10 off of him. And so again, a massively impressive job from Haas in terms of strategy, an incredible pace demonstrated by Hulkenberg, not only by him, but Magnussen too. There were 2 other drivers, Russell and Stroll, who did not follow a traditional strategy path either. But in that case, Russell and Stroll elected to go for mediums twice and then change for hards. Now, what I could see between, let's say, Sainz, Hamilton, and Russell is that the tire degradation on the mediums and the hards didn't really differ all that much. And what was key for Russell is to go for the hards at the end as early as possible, because during those 5 laps when he had the hard tires on and Hamilton and Piastri were still pushing that hard stint, he was a lot quicker than them. I think he was gaining a second or 2 seconds ahead of his teammate and a second ahead of Piastri, and that was the key at the end. That is why Piastri, even though he was faster, ultimately he could not overtake Russell, because that gap that he could carve out for himself in those 5 laps that he was on the brand new hard tires and his rivals were competing on the used hard tires, he gained a massive advantage. That is why I'm saying that although the forecasted strategy was used by plenty of drivers, it wasn't the strategy to give you the biggest advantages during this race. So let's unpack the Norris-Verstappen situation. In the first stint, Verstappen was faster than Norris, not by a lot. Norris was close behind, and in the second stint, they were demonstrating the same pace overall. At that time, Verstappen was complaining about his tire dag and about keeping things behind him, and I'm not sure whether that was code language for something else other than Norris, because Norris was clearly not getting close to him, so I wonder if he was struggling with something at the time. All the drama unfolded when Verstappen went into the pits for his last tire compound, but the pit stop was too long. It was about 6.5 seconds because the team was struggling with his rear tires at the time, and so that put Norris in his DRS range, and we could see that in the sprint that Norris in Verstappen's DRS range is dangerous. Verstappen could not pull away, and Norris was demonstrating an insanely quick pace at the time. So they were following one another really closely. That was this question of Verstappen moving under braking and following the patterns of Norris's movements. I think that was on the limit more or less, and then the turn 3 incident came. So Verstappen was focusing on hitting that apex and braking at the most optimal time possible while ignoring Norris, which then led to the collision at the end of the day. The 10-second penalty was fair. It was Verstappen's mistake and he should have considered Norris. Norris didn't back out. We have seen incidents like that in this exact turn before when other drivers did back out. That's not to say that Norris was to blame here at all. I'm just saying that this is what led to the collision. Max not considering Norris and Norris not backing out at the end. So all in all, the penalty was fair in my books. What was a bit more interesting is that after that little touch, Max forced out Norris again, and I thought that was completely unnecessary at that point. So that is what I have a bigger issue with. Both drivers got a puncture. Norris had to retire from the race. I think they were both a little bit desperate leading up to turn 3 because there was this inevitability for Norris with the 5-second time penalty, and because Verstappen's pit stop was messed up, he was desperate to get out of that DRS range, which he couldn't do. In the end, Verstappen did finish the race in 5th position. He was still massively ahead of Perez, I think about 17 seconds. That tells you a lot, but then again, Perez had that side put issue, so I will give him that. And then we had our race winner, George Russell, who was sitting about 15 seconds away from that Verstappen-Norris action, but he had to be there. He had to have that good strategy and those nice lap times compared to the rest of the pack, and that is what provided him his win. The one last thing I would mention, there were a few penalties handed out, aside from Norris's penalty and Verstappen's. Hamilton and Albon both crossed the line at the pit lane, so they received a 5-second penalty, and Alonso had that weird look-up when he torpedoed into Joe, and for that he received a 10-second penalty as well. So what are the conclusions after this weekend? Haas bagged a lot of points, and they are now ahead of Alpine, not by a little, by 10 points, which is amazing. Mercedes capitalized on what Ferrari couldn't this weekend. This is not the first time. As I said, if Mercedes continues on this trajectory, they have a lot of good things coming in future races. Astons are now not only not part of the top 5, they are part of the midfield and sometimes lower midfield. Gasly, Ricciardo, and both Haas drivers finishing ahead of them. I think that's a low blow for the team. So naturally, I have to talk about Perez again, who was about 2 galaxies away from Verstappen during the entirety of this weekend. And damages, used tires aside, he's not showing what he should be in that second Red Bull seat. He needs to pick up the pace. Otherwise, the constructorship is going to be lost. And also for his sake as well. I know that he has a 2-year deal with Red Bull. How secure that is, I'm not certain. Is the relationship between Norris and Verstappen forever fractured? Look, I'm sure this incident did not help. That's not to say that they will be mortal enemies from now on, but communications between the two may change a little bit. And finally, my driver of the day is not Norris, although he was elected to be driver of the day again, which is still very weird. My driver of the day is definitely Hulkenberg, and if I look at the weekend as a whole, then I would say Magnussen was one of the best throughout. Gasly demonstrated some good pace again, but he was not always there with his teammates, so I would double down on Hulkenberg for this weekend. But what do you think? Have I missed anything? What do you think about the Max and Norris incident or the Perez Verstappen gap? Let me know in the comment section below.